there seems to be a lack of a leadership team now. Now, in previous years, we've spoken about how the leadership team is very important at Liverpool. Van Dijk being the head of it, Mohamed Salah being very important in it as well. McAllister, I remember reading, and been elevated to this level as well. When I look around the team at the moment, though, my biggest concern, what I believe Iraola's biggest concern away from the transfer market, is figuring out who the new leaders are going to be. I think during Klopp's era, he was able to establish pretty quickly, we've seen Jordan Henderson as a crucial leader. We obviously made the additions of Alisson and Van Dijk into the club, who became leaders. Firmino developed into a leader. I think although leadership can be found on the market, it is a different market to what we were dealing with, at the start of the Klopp era. I think figuring out who the leaders are within the team currently and who's going to develop into those leaders, who Iraola can look at and go, right, I can depend on you to develop in this way, or I can look at you and see you as a future, not necessarily a captain, but a future leader within the team. Andy Robertson was never the captain of Liverpool, which certainly was a leader within the group. I look around the group at the moment and I'm concerned about that. Dominic Szoboszlai, great example. I think Dominic Szoboszlai at times gets overly praised, but I also think he's overly scrutinized at the same time. I think on the pitch, you can never fault his dedication. You can never fault his work ethic, but his work ethic necessarily always translating into, leadership. I'm not sure. I think the way you apply yourself on the pitch is one facet of leadership. I think another is how vocal you are in the dressing room, and another is how you carry yourself outside of the club and in training. I think Mohamed Salah, although maybe he wasn't the most vocal on the pitch, he certainly was a clear leader in the training ground and on the training pitch rather, and certainly was a leader on the pitch itself without having to be the most vocal. Van Dijk, clearly a vocal leader on the pitch, clearly a vocal leader in the dressing room. Jordan Henderson was clearly, again, a dressing room player. James Milner, a dressing room player. Andy Robertson as well. And I look at the club at the moment, I look at the squad, and I wonder who our dressing room leaders are. Who are the voices in the current dressing room when it's 1-0 down at halftime or 2-0 down or drawing in a game that you're really struggling to get through? Who is able to command, expectation? Who's able to demand a result? Who's able to pull that extra 5% out? Because, of course, it comes from the coach who creates the culture within the club. I absolutely believe that. Coaches create culture. I've said it before. Say it again. And Iraola has to create a culture in which people are able to blossom into leaders. But then if I were to identify names that can become the next Andy Robertson, that can become the next Konate in terms of, not that Konate was necessarily a leader in the defense, but a reliable, leader within the group. Now, of course, like I said, Alisson was signed. Van Dijk was signed. I think leaders on the market, to be honest, I feel are few or far between. Liverpool's recruitment strategy this summer, again, seems to be aiming towards more younger players. Obviously, we brought in Munoz. We're looking at Diomande. I think it would be certainly unfair to bring in a teenager and expect him to be a leader on the pitch. Of course, he can lead by example. But who can come into the dressing room right now and be like a James Milner, where they're demanding that extra 5%, they're demanding that extra 10%? I don't really see that on the market at the moment. And if you do, let me know in the comments who you see. Ryan Gravenberch, I think, is a good player, at times a great player. I don't see necessarily a natural leader in him. McAllister, I think, is a good player who had a bad season. We don't know his future. Curtis Jones knows the club inside out, but we don't know if he's even going to be here next year. I think if Curtis Jones is here next year, he'd be someone I look at to develop into a leadership role. Someone who knows the club, knows the expectations, has been here during great times and not so great times. I think if Curtis Jones is to develop into a prominent figure, he would have to take a leadership role in that respect. I look at Isak and Wirtz, these two insanely expensive signings. I don't think Isak is a leader. I think he can be a talisman. I think he can be an insanely reliable frontman, but I don't think he's a leader in that way. That's not a negative. Lewandowski, I wouldn't necessarily say is a leader, but he's a reliable player and he's a world-class player. You can be a world-class player without being a leader. And I think that's really important to recognize. Not every leader is this world-class player technically. James Milner, I think at times, had quality without a doubt, and he's a phenomenal player, phenomenal, legend of football, certainly English football. But there weren't many times where I think people looked at James Milner and said, world-class. But he was world-class in application, world-class in terms of how he led others in every facet of the game, through the club. And I think we need more of that. I think we need more players to take that kind of role. Not every player in a squad needs to be the individual genius. You need team players. And I think Liverpool need to either develop that internally and find those qualities, find those voices within the dressing room, or we need to go and recruit them. Florian Wirtz, I don't know. I still don't really know what Florian Wirtz is going to be for Liverpool. I refuse to write him off. I refuse to dismiss him. He doesn't seem vocal. He seems very relaxed, very composed, which is great. But he doesn't seem very vocal. How he is in training, I don't know. People say that he certainly applies himself. He's a very polite, likable person, which is great. But I don't see many leadership qualities. Again, I see a player similar to Isak, where we have this world-class technical player who will work very hard. I have absolutely no doubt, but not necessarily a leader. We removed the leader from the front line this summer. Again, I'm looking at the front line. I'm looking at the midfield. I'm looking at the defense. And I'm asking myself, who is the leaders here? Because Van Dijk could very well be gone at the end of next year. Alisson could very well be gone at the end of next year. Robertson's not there anymore. Salah's not there anymore. I don't see a leader. Can we really expect Jaquet to step up and become this vocal leader within 12 months? Can Leone? That is my concern. I think Liverpool have an abundance, maybe the most in the league in terms of young quality. And I do think we have players who can lead by example on the pitch. But when you need someone in the dressing room to pull that extra 5%, that person to maintain standards when maybe you've won 5 games on the bounce and maybe the odd player feels like they can relax. Where is the vocal? Where is the voice? Where is the Andy Robertson saying, no, we can't relax. We need to go further. Beyond Van Dijk, beyond Alisson, I'm not sure. That is my concern for Liverpool. That is my concern. What Iraola, I think, needs to find a solution for. I think the first video I ever did was coaches create culture, right? Iraola needs to create a culture where people hold each other accountable, where every player in their own way has a voice and they have clear leaders to follow, whether that's the coaching staff, the senior players, or of course, Iraola himself. That's one thing we've lacked over the last couple of years. And I'm not saying that we didn't have that in the last couple of years. Obviously, we won the league. But beyond the players that were already here, I haven't seen anyone step up into a leadership role. During Jurgen Klopp's era, multiple players developed through and became leaders. I haven't seen that in the last 2 years under Arne Slot, and that needs to be solved. I think leaders on the pitch, like we said, we can name the ones, like in a sense, Wirtz, Zach can be these leaders on the pitch because of the quality they have. When you're winning and needing to find the last sort of a bit moment of genius, they can lead it there. Who are the hardest workers in the team? Well, I look at Kirkes, which I know is a bit of an odd shout, but Kirkes reminds me of Andy Robertson in a lot of ways. I think if he can be molded into a bit more of a, I don't want to say stronger character, but a bit more of a sensible character, which I believe he's under the right management and alongside the right centre-back in order to do so, then I think we could have a real leader, again, on the training pitch and on the pitch. Beyond Van Dijk, who is the most vocal in the team? I struggle to think about it. Like, I struggle to identify a vocal player within the team. Who's barking orders, holding players accountable? I don't see it. And you don't hear about it either. Who is the standard setter beyond Van Dijk? Tell me who you think it is. I'm unsure. And I think that's something that needs to be solved. I don't think Dominic Szoboszlai can turn into the captain of the club. I don't think Kirkes can turn into the captain of the club. I love Isak. I love Wirtz. I love Szoboszlai. But I don't see them as captains of Liverpool. The captain of Liverpool needs to embody not just on the pitch values, but city values, moral values, the club culture. It's what Gerrard did. It's what Henderson did. It's what Van Dijk has done. And it's an interesting one because it's a conversation I think that can happen throughout the year, throughout good moments and bad. We have so many young players, so many young, exciting players. Rio Ngamoa, Kumas, Leone, Dan's Wright, the 2 young centre-backs that we signed, Jaquet, Leone as well. We've got these young, interesting players. Bradley, again, they're hard-working. We've got these interesting players, like we've got James McConnell, we've got Bajcetic as well. They're all exciting, but they need to be guided by somebody. I think, you have that very famous saying, you don't win anything with youngsters. I'm not necessarily saying Liverpool needs to go and win the league this season, but I need to know who the next leader of this team is. Who are the next voices? This video is just me more posing a question without necessarily having an answer, but who within the club do you think is a leader or potentially is a future leader? Doesn't necessarily need to be a captain, but who you can imagine evolving into a leader. Let me know. State your reasoning why. And yeah, I hope you guys are all having a good week.